I wasn't the kind of pilot who got nervous when the phone rang. But that morning, something in the silence on the other end told me my life was about to change. No introductions, no small talk, just a calm voice asking me to report to a location I'd never heard of, at a time that didn't allow for hesitation. The man didn't even say my name. He just said, "We need you. Be there." The coordinates they gave me led to a stretch of desert in Nevada, far away from anything familiar. As my car left the last paved road and rolled onto dirt, I started to feel the weight of what I'd agreed to. I'd heard whispers about secret projects out there, but no one ever came back with answers, just quiet stares and a look that told you to stop asking questions. By the time I reached the perimeter gate, the sun was setting, painting the sand in orange and red. The guards didn't smile, didn't explain, and didn't ask for identification in the usual way. They already knew who I was. One of them looked at me like I was being measured, not greeted. Then he simply pointed toward a low building ahead. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. There were no clocks on the walls, no windows, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of jet fuel. The man who met me there wasn't wearing a uniform, but everything about him screamed military. Short hair, straight posture, and a voice that didn't waste words. He introduced himself only as Major. No last name. He asked if I understood the meaning of top secret, and I said yes, but I don't think I truly understood until that night. He slid a folder across the table, thin and unmarked, and told me to read it carefully. The paper inside wasn't about where I was or what this was, but about who I was, every flight hour, every medical record, every evaluation I'd ever had. They knew everything. That alone was enough to make me sit straighter. Then he asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Do you believe in limits, Captain?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. He nodded, almost like he'd expected that. "Good. Because you're about to fly something that doesn't." From there, things moved fast. They took my phone, my wallet, even my watch, and placed them in a locked drawer. I was escorted to a dormitory-style room, no TV, no personal items, just a bed, a desk, and a small lamp. The walls were so thin I could hear faint conversations from the next room, though none of the voices were familiar. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what kind of aircraft demanded this level of secrecy, what kind of mission could pull me so far off the map. At sunrise, they drove me deeper into the desert, past empty hangars and silent runways, until we reached a wide building with no markings. The air smelled sharper there, metallic, mixed with the heavy scent of something chemical, something I would later know as JP7 fuel. I signed another stack of papers, the kind that reminded you, in bold print, that talking about what you saw here would ruin your life. Then the major looked at me and said, "Ready to meet her?" We walked through a narrow corridor, past rows of closed doors, until we reached a set of double doors that opened into a hangar so quiet it felt almost sacred. At first, I didn't see it. The lighting was dim, and the space was vast. Then my eyes adjusted, and there it was, tucked in the far corner, like a predator waiting in the shadows. The Blackbird. It didn't look like any aircraft I'd ever seen. Long, sharp, and blacker than night, its surface seemed to drink in the light. The angles were wrong in a way that made it look dangerous, alive even. My first thought wasn't about speed or power, it was that this thing didn't belong here, on the ground. It looked like it was straining to break free, to be where it was meant to be, high above the world. I took a few steps closer, my boots echoing on the hangar floor. Up close, I noticed the strange texture of its skin, the panels that didn't quite align like they should. Later, I'd learned that the heat of flight would seal those gaps. At that moment, I just stared, trying to understand how something so alien could also be so precise. Engineers moved around it like surgeons in an operating room, silent, focused. They didn't look at me. To them, I was just another piece of the machine, something that would either fit or break. The major stopped a few feet from the nose and turned to me. "This is your new world," he said. "You don't fly her. You ride her. And if you don't respect that, she'll kill you." I didn't know what to say. The words felt heavy, almost rehearsed, but the look in his eyes told me they weren't for show. In that moment, I realized that whatever this program was, it was bigger than any one pilot. Bigger than me. I felt a chill run through me, the kind you get when you know you've stepped onto a path you can't step back from. That night, they let me back into my room, but I couldn't shake the image of the Blackbird from my mind. Every detail replayed, the matte black surface, the way it seemed to lean forward like it was impatient, the faint heat radiating off the metal even though it hadn't flown that day. I didn't know when I'd be allowed to fly it, or if I'd even make it through whatever tests were coming next. All I knew was that I'd been called for something that felt impossible to turn away from. And deep down, I knew, nothing in my life would ever feel the same again. The morning after I first saw the Blackbird, I was handed a plain envelope with my name typed neatly in the corner. Inside was a schedule, no explanations, just times, room numbers, and a list of initials I didn't recognize. That was the start of what they called indoctrination, though no one ever used that word out loud. Every day for weeks, I was pushed harder than I thought possible. It started with physical conditioning, long runs in the desert before sunrise, altitude chamber drills that left my head pounding, and hours of strength and endurance training. They needed to know we could handle the extremes, the crushing weight of acceleration, the thin air where your brain forgets how to think, and the constant pressure to react without hesitation. Then came the academics. They crammed our minds with numbers, protocols, and systems that felt more like rocket science than aviation. The J-58 engines weren't just powerful, they were unpredictable, temperamental beasts that demanded respect. We studied fluid dynamics, fuel transfer systems, and emergency procedures that read like horror stories, uncontrolled decompressions, flameouts at Mach 3, hydraulic failures at altitudes where ejection was just a slower way to die. Most of us didn't talk much between sessions. The other candidates, men like me, plucked from fighter squadrons and reconnaissance wings, carried the same look in their eyes, sharp, focused, and slightly haunted. We never asked where they'd flown before or what missions they'd run. In this place, your past didn't matter. What mattered was whether you could survive what was coming. The first time they strapped me into the pressure suit, it felt like stepping into another world. The suit was bulky, stiff, and smelled faintly of rubber and metal. They explained how it worked, how the sealed system would keep me alive when the cockpit turned into a hostile void. Breathing through the hose felt unnatural at first, like the air had to fight its way into my lungs. By the time they zipped the helmet in place, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then they locked me in the simulator. It wasn't a game, not even close. The cockpit was a perfect replica of the SR-71s, every switch, every dial, every warning light exactly where it would be at 80,000 feet. The first time the simulated engines roared to life, I felt the vibration in my chest, even though I knew it wasn't real. They threw everything at me, engine failures, decompressions, hydraulic leaks, even a full electrical blackout. Every time, they wanted to see how fast I could think, how calm I could stay. The instructors were brutal. They didn't raise their voices, didn't curse or yell, but the disappointment in their silence when you failed was worse than any shouting. One mistake, and they'd reset the scenario without a word. You'd sit there in that pressurized coffin, drenched in sweat, replaying every second in your mind until you figured out what you'd missed. There were moments when I doubted if I belonged there. Not because of the flying, that part felt like second nature, but because of the constant, relentless demand for perfection. The Blackbird didn't forgive. You either learned to think ahead of her, or you became just another story whispered in these halls. What kept me going was the quiet understanding that none of us wanted to admit out loud. There was nowhere else in the world where we'd ever get the chance to do this. This wasn't just another aircraft. This was the edge of the possible, and we were the ones chosen to stand there. As the weeks went by, the tests got harder. We trained for high-G turns until our vision blurred. We practiced emergency ejections in the desert, landing in parched sand while crews ran drills around us like clockwork. They taught us how to read the sky, how to trust the sensors but also trust our instincts, because at Mach 3, a few seconds of doubt could kill you. And there were the psychological tests, the ones no one liked to talk about. Hours in dark rooms with nothing but a voice asking questions, trying to crack the parts of you that even you didn't know were there. They wanted to see what you'd do under pressure, how far you could bend before you broke. A few candidates didn't make it past that stage. One morning, their rooms were empty, beds stripped clean, no explanations given. The nights were the hardest. After the long days, I'd sit alone in my room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of the air conditioning. Sometimes, I'd hear a distant engine start up, that unmistakable low growl of the Blackbird's J-58S, and it would pull me out of my fatigue like a shot of adrenaline. I'd imagine what it would feel like to be strapped in, canopy closed, the runway ahead stretching into the desert night. Eventually, I stopped imagining. The briefings shifted from theory to practice. They started pairing us with reconnaissance systems officers, the other half of the Blackbird's crew, the men who managed the sensors and navigation systems while we flew. You could tell who you'd mesh with and who you wouldn't. In that cockpit, trust wasn't optional, it was survival. One evening, the major pulled me aside. He didn't smile, didn't offer congratulations, just said, "You've got clearance. Report to the flight line tomorrow at 0500. That night, sleep didn't come. I sat by the narrow window, watching the desert stars, feeling the weight of what was ahead. For weeks, they'd been molding me, stripping away everything that didn't belong in that cockpit. Tomorrow, for the first time, I'd find out if I had what it really took to sit in the Blackbird and make her mine, if only for a few hours. And deep down, I knew this wasn't just training anymore. This was the moment where the program stopped being a mystery and started being my reality. The first time I was allowed to walk up to the Blackbird without an escort stopping me felt almost unreal. For weeks, I'd seen her from a distance, through hangar windows, from the edge of the flight line, or in quick glimpses during late-night maintenance runs, but never close enough to touch. That morning, just before sunrise, they finally handed me a badge with a clearance code that opened the heavy steel doors at the edge of the runway. The hangar was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. No chatter, no unnecessary noise, just the hum of overhead lights and the occasional metallic clang of a tool being set down. She was there, waiting, angled toward the open bay doors, her matte black skin swallowing every bit of light around her. Seeing the State Route 71 up close was like standing next to a predator at rest. She wasn't built to sit still. Every curve, every sharp line seemed designed for one purpose: speed. I stopped a few feet away, not sure if I was even allowed to touch her. The crew chief, a man with a face like carved stone, walked by and muttered, "Go on. She won't bite." His voice had a kind of pride in it, the way you'd talk about a wild animal you'd raised. Up close, the Blackbird didn't look like any plane I'd ever flown. The panels didn't fit flush, there were thin gaps running along the fuselage, seams that looked almost careless. At first, I thought it was a flaw until I remembered what the instructors had told us in class. Once she hit Mach 3, the skin would heat up so much that the titanium would expand and those seams would seal tight. On the ground, she looked imperfect. In the sky, she became whole. I reached out and let my glove graze the skin. It was cold, colder than I expected, like the metal had never been touched by the sun. There was a strange texture to it, rough in places, almost like sandpaper. It wasn't the polished, clean finish of a fighter jet, it was something different, something alien. The smell in the hangar was sharp and chemical, the JP-7 fuel hanging in the air. It clung to your clothes, got into your skin. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was impossible to ignore. That smell would become part of me in the weeks to come, so familiar that I'd miss it when I was away from the base. One of the maintenance techs climbed down from the ladder near the nose and gave me a nod. "She'll talk to you," he said, almost casually, like that explained everything. "Not in words, but you'll know." At the time, I didn't understand. Later, I would. Walking around her took longer than I expected. Every angle seemed to reveal something new: the long, needle-like nose, the cockpit glass dark as obsidian, the massive nacelles that housed those temperamental J-58 engines. Standing next to those engines, I couldn't help but feel small. They weren't just power plants, they were forces of nature. Each one could propel us faster than a bullet, faster than any human had a right to go. I climbed the ladder and peered into the cockpit for the first time. It wasn't glamorous. There were no sleek displays, no futuristic panels, just a tight space filled with switches, dials, and analog gauges. Everything had a purpose, nothing was there for comfort. The seat looked unforgiving, more like a piece of equipment than a chair. But sitting there, even for a moment, staring out over that impossibly long nose, I could feel what this aircraft was made to do. I imagined what it would be like to be strapped in, canopy locked, the engines screaming behind me, the world blurring past at takeoff. I tried to picture the horizon bending, the sky turning from blue to dark indigo, the stars beginning to shine at midday. For the first time, it didn't feel like something far away. It felt close, so close I could almost taste it. The crew treated her like she was alive. They didn't just maintain her, they tended to her. Every bolt tightened with care, every panel checked twice. There was no rushing, no shortcuts. The Blackbird didn't tolerate mistakes, and everyone there knew it. There was a quiet reverence in the way they worked, a respect that was almost ritualistic. I stayed longer than I should have, circling her, memorizing every line and angle, every detail I could take in. She was bigger than I expected, and yet somehow she looked faster than anything I'd ever seen. Even sitting still, she radiated motion, like a coiled spring waiting to release. As I left the hangar, the sun had started to rise, casting a thin orange glow across the desert. The Blackbird caught none of it. She absorbed the light, stayed dark and sharp, as if the morning itself couldn't touch her. I stopped at the door, turned for one last look, and felt that familiar chill again, the same one I'd felt the first night they showed her to me. I realized then that this wasn't just another aircraft. She was a line drawn across the map of my life, before the Blackbird, and after. I didn't know it yet, but every mission, every flight, every memory that would follow started in that quiet hangar, with me standing there, too awed to speak, staring at a machine that seemed less like something we'd built and more like something we'd found. And as I walked away, I remember thinking one clear, undeniable thought: whatever it took, whatever it cost, I was going to earn the right to fly her. Ground training was where they broke you down, piece by piece, and rebuilt you into someone who could handle the Blackbird. It wasn't about flying yet. It was about survival. From the moment the program started, they made it clear, this aircraft didn't forgive mistakes, and the desert around the base was littered with reminders of those who had underestimated her. Every morning began before the sun. We'd jog across the edge of the runway in the thin, dry air, the horizon still black, the desert stars so sharp they looked like they could cut the sky. It wasn't about fitness, it was about discipline. They wanted to see who showed up ready, even when no one was watching. By the time the sun came up, we were already in the classroom, sweat dried on our collars, notebooks open, ready for another avalanche of technical data. They taught us everything, down to the smallest detail. How the J-58 engines worked when they were behaving, and how they behaved when they weren't. How the airframe expanded under heat until it was almost 3 inches longer in flight than it was on the ground. How to manage the fuel system, transferring the JP-7 from tank to tank to keep the center of gravity balanced while the aircraft was screaming past Mach 3. There were no shortcuts. Every switch in that cockpit had a purpose, and if you didn't understand it, you didn't belong there. The pressure suit training was the hardest part for me at first. The first time they zipped me in, it felt like being trapped in a metal box with no way out. The suit was bulky, the gloves clumsy, and the helmet sealed so tight that every breath sounded like it echoed inside my own skull. The techs walked us through the systems, the cooling pack strapped to the chest, the oxygen feed, the emergency release valves, but all I could think about was how unnatural it felt to breathe through that hose. We practiced everything in those suits, climbing into the cockpit, running checklists, even simple movements like turning switches and adjusting dials. It was all muscle memory, drilled over and over until it became automatic. Because when you're 30 miles above the ground and something goes wrong, panic isn't an option. Your hands have to know what to do before your brain even catches up. Then there were the egress drills. They'd strap us into the cockpit mock-up, black out the canopy, and pump in simulated smoke. You had seconds to unbuckle, twist out of the straps, and find your way to the exit before the alarms hit. They'd repeat it over and over, until the sequence was burned into your reflexes. Some guys panicked the first few times, clawing at the straps, shouting through the helmet comms. The instructors never raised their voices, they just reset the drill and made you do it again. The simulator was where the reality of the Blackbird began to take shape. It wasn't a game, not a training video with flashing cues. It was a full replica of the cockpit, wired to recreate every vibration, every pitch, every sound. You'd sit there, sealed in your suit, engines spooling in your ears, and suddenly you weren't in a room anymore, you were at 80,000 feet, with the earth curving below and the aircraft trembling around you. They threw failures at us without warning. Compressor stalls, hydraulic leaks, electrical failures, each one a test to see if you'd freeze or react. I remember one session where the left engine flamed out mid-climb. The cockpit alarms screamed, the simulator bucked, and for a split second, I felt the edge of panic. Then my hands moved, throttle back, restart sequence, cross-feed engaged, before I even realized I had done it. That was the moment I understood what they were building in us, instinct, pure and unshakable. We also trained with our reconnaissance systems officers. The RSO wasn't just a second set of hands, he was your lifeline. He monitored the sensors, the navigation, the systems you couldn't afford to watch while keeping the Blackbird steady at Mach 3. Trust between pilot and RSO wasn't optional. They paired us up early, testing our communication in drills, making sure we could anticipate each other's moves without a word. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal session in the simulator, my instructor leaned against the console and said quietly, "You don't fly her. You manage her. She decides if you come home." At the time, I thought it was just a line meant to intimidate me. Later, I'd learned it was the truest thing anyone ever said about the State Route 71. The psychological side of training was quieter but just as intense. Long interviews in windowless rooms where they pushed you to talk about fear, about failure, about what you'd do if things went wrong at altitude. They didn't want bravado. They wanted to know you understood the risks. A few men didn't make it past that phase. One day they'd be sitting next to you in class, the next their locker was empty, and no one ever mentioned their name again. By the third week, exhaustion became a constant companion. My body was sore, my mind overloaded with data and procedures, but there was a strange clarity that came with it. Every checklist, every emergency sequence started to feel natural. I could see the cockpit in my mind even when I closed my eyes, every switch exactly where it needed to be. I'll never forget the first time they ran a full mission profile in the simulator. Takeoff, climb, cruise, recon pass, descent, everything but the real G-forces. For over 3 hours, I was in that seat, following every step, every communication, every system check. When the canopy opened at the end, and the cool air hit my face, I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what I'd just done. That night, sitting alone in my room, I finally allowed myself to think about what was coming. Up until then, it had all been preparation, numbers, drills, theory. But soon, I'd be in the real thing. The runway lights stretching into the desert night, the J-58S roaring to life behind me, and the Blackbird waiting to decide whether I was worthy of her trust. Ground training didn't just teach you how to fly the State Route 71. It taught you how to respect it. And by the time those long weeks were over, I understood that lesson better than anything else. The Blackbird wasn't just an aircraft. She was a challenge, a promise, and a warning all at once. The first time I heard the Blackbird come alive, it didn't sound like any engine I'd ever known. Fighters roared, bombers rumbled, but the SR-71's J-58S screamed. It was a sharp, metallic howl that you felt in your chest and in your teeth, a sound so alien it almost didn't seem mechanical. That morning, I arrived on the flight line before sunrise. The desert was still cold, the air sharp and dry, and the sky just starting to fade from black to a pale gray. The hangar doors were already open, and there she was, parked on the apron, black skin glinting faintly under the sodium lights. Even sitting still, she had a presence that silenced everything around her. The crew chief met me with a clipboard and a nod. No ceremony, no congratulations. Just a simple, suit up. We're on schedule. The pressure suit techs worked in silence, guiding me into the layers, checking every seal, every valve, every connector. By then, the routine was almost automatic, cooling vest zipped, gloves locked, helmet sealed. When they connected the umbilical to the portable air supply, the hiss of oxygen filled my ears, and the rest of the world faded away. Walking toward her, suited up, felt different. The ramp lights cast long shadows across the tarmac, and the Blackbird towered ahead of me, sleek and sharp, like something waiting to be unleashed. I climbed the ladder slowly, careful with every step, feeling the bulk of the suit fight against me. When I lowered myself into the cockpit, the familiar smell of heated electronics, hydraulic fluid, and JP-7 hit me like a wave. It was a smell I'd come to crave. Inside, everything was tight and precise. I began the pre-start checks, my hands moving through the sequence I'd practiced 100 times in the simulator: battery on, avionics check, fuel boost pumps. My RSO climbed into the rear cockpit, his voice calm over the intercom as we cross-checked systems. Outside, the crew moved around her in a choreographed dance, every man knowing exactly where to be and when. The J-58S couldn't start on their own. They needed what we called the start cart, two massive Buick V8 engines mounted together, driving a single output shaft that spun the Blackbird's engine up to the speed it needed to light. It was old technology, noisy and violent, but it worked every time. I gave the signal, and the crew chief rolled the cart into position under the left nacelle. Over the intercom, the ground crew called out the sequence. I felt the vibration through the airframe as the cart spooled up, the V8S roaring like muscle cars in a confined space. Then the starter shaft engaged with the J-58, and the whole aircraft trembled as the turbine began to spin. I monitored the gauges, watching the RPM climb. At the precise moment, I opened the fuel valve, and the JP-7 began to flow. A second later, there was a low, hollow whump, followed by the rising, metallic scream of the engine catching. The left J-58 came alive, shaking the cockpit, the sound so deep and sharp it blurred into a physical sensation. The crew chief moved to the other nacelle, and we repeated the process. The right engine spooled up, caught, and then screamed in harmony with the left. The Blackbird was awake now, the cockpit vibrating, gauges alive, every system talking to me at once. Sitting there, strapped into that tight seat, I felt a surge of adrenaline that no simulator could prepare me for. The engines weren't just running, they were alive, angry, impatient. The heat from the exhaust shimmered on the ramp behind us, and the smell of burning JP-7 drifted back into the cockpit. The ground crew moved with calm precision, but you could sense the respect in the way they handled her. They checked the nacelles, the landing gear, the fueling ports, every inch of her black skin. Then, one by one, they stepped back and gave the thumbs up. In my headset, the voice of the crew chief crackled, steady and calm. "Pilot, RSO, engines are stable. You're clear to taxi when ready." I acknowledged, my gloved hand gripping the throttle, feeling the power humming just under my touch. The vibration through the seat was constant, a deep thrumming that made the Blackbird feel less like a machine and more like something alive, breathing under you, waiting to be let loose. For a moment, I sat there and let it all sink in. The weeks of training, the endless drills, the lectures, the sleepless nights, all of it had led to this. I could feel the tension in my chest, the excitement mixing with a sharp edge of fear. Not the kind that makes you freeze, but the kind that sharpens your focus, that reminds you what's at stake. I glanced over the instruments again, hydraulic pressure steady, fuel flow nominal, electrical systems green across the board. My RSO's voice came over the intercom, calm and deliberate, "All systems check. She's ready." I keyed the mic, "Roger that. Let's take her out." The ground crew signaled us forward, and as I released the brakes, the Blackbird began to roll, slow at first, the engines growling, the vibration coursing through the airframe. Every foot closer to the runway felt like a step closer to something I'd been chasing my entire life. That morning, I didn't know how the flight would go, or how the Blackbird would treat me once we were in her domain. All I knew, as we taxied toward the edge of the desert runway with the engines screaming behind us, was that I was about to leave everything familiar behind. And once those wheels left the ground, there would be no going back. The first time I pushed the throttles forward on the Blackbird, the world went silent for a second. It wasn't real silence, the J-58s were already screaming behind me, but in that moment, all the noise faded into the background. All that existed was the runway stretching out ahead, the vibration under my boots, and the feeling that everything in my life had been leading to this exact point. The sun was just breaking over the desert horizon that morning, painting the sky in pale orange and soft purple. The ramp had been busy with the usual ballet of the ground crew, but once we reached the end of the runway, it was just me, my RSO, and the jet. The radio chatter died down, and the aircraft settled into that sharp, vibrating hum, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I ran through the final checks, hands steady even though my heart was hammering. Hydraulic pressure, good. Fuel flow, steady. Control surfaces, responsive. The RSO's calm voice came through the intercom, every word measured and exact, all systems nominal. "She's yours." I wrapped my hands around the throttles, feeling the resistance. The Blackbird wasn't a docile airplane. She demanded precision, respect. I eased the throttles forward, and the roar of the J-58s climbed into that feral scream that no simulator could ever capture. The entire frame shuddered, the cockpit vibrating so hard the instruments blurred for a second. The acceleration was brutal. The Blackbird didn't roll down the runway, it launched. The nose dipped slightly as the gear dug into the tarmac, and I felt myself pressed into the seat as if an invisible hand was holding me back. The numbers on the airspeed indicator climbed fast, too fast for my mind to fully register. The runway blurred into a gray smear beneath us, the desert flashing by in my peripheral vision. At 170 knots, I eased back on the yoke. The nose lifted smoothly, obedient, and then, just like that, we were airborne. The vibration changed instantly. The grinding rumble of tires on concrete vanished, replaced by the clean, high-frequency hum of the Blackbird in flight. My stomach caught for a moment, that brief, weightless sense you get when you leave the earth behind. The climb out was steep. The desert dropped away beneath us, shrinking into a patchwork of browns and reds, the runway just a thin white scar on the sand. The sky ahead deepened from soft blue to a sharp, endless gradient that hinted at the black edge of space we'd soon touch. The first thing you notice in the air is the heat. The cockpit temperature rises fast as the J-58S push the aircraft forward, and the pressure suit feels heavier, tighter, like an extra skin you can't escape. The smell of hot metal and JP-7 fills the cabin, mixed with that faint electric tang of the avionics humming at full load. "Climb looks good," the RSO said from the back seat, his tone calm but charged with the same current I felt. We were both strapped into a Legend, and for the first time, she was letting us see what she could do. Passing through 10,000 feet, I eased the throttles a little more. The response was immediate. She surged forward, the airspeed needle jumping as the desert vanished completely behind us. It felt impossible, unnatural, like the laws of physics had bent just for her. There's a moment every pilot remembers, that instant where you realize you're not flying a machine anymore, you're part of it. I felt it as we punched through 20,000 feet, the horizon curving gently, the world below turning into a hazy blue-brown smear. Every input was smooth, clean, like the Blackbird was reading my thoughts. By 30,000 feet, the pressure in my ears eased as the cabin fully pressurized. Outside, the world had gone quiet, the chaos of takeoff replaced by an eerie stillness. Only the steady whine of the engines reminded me we were still screaming through the air faster than anything else on the planet. "Engine temps are holding steady," my RSO said. "Fuel flow's perfect." "She's happy." I didn't answer right away. I was too busy taking it in, the sensation of speed that felt less like motion and more like falling forward through time itself. The Blackbird wasn't just fast, she redefined the word. And this was just the beginning. As we leveled off for the first phase of the training flight, I glanced out the side window. The curve of the Earth was subtle but there, and the thin haze of the atmosphere clung like a fragile veil. Down below, the Mojave stretched endlessly, but it already felt like another world. "Not bad for a first dance," the voice from the back seat teased, but even through the static, I could hear the same awe in his tone. I allowed myself a tight smile, though my focus never wavered from the instruments. There was no room for complacency up here. One mistake, one distraction, and the Blackbird would remind you who was in charge. We pushed a little harder, testing the limits, but always within the envelope laid out in the training. Every climb, every bank, every adjustment was deliberate, measured. The instructors had drilled that discipline into us: respect the jet, and she'll take care of you. Forget that, and she'll bite. As we turned back toward the base, I felt something shift. The nerves that had knotted my stomach all morning were gone, replaced by a quiet, sharp focus. This wasn't just flying, it was something else entirely, something purer. On final approach, the airframe buffeted slightly as I reduced power, the J-58S dropping from their scream to a deep, steady growl. The runway rose to meet us, and I guided her in, hands steady on the controls. The wheels touched down smoother than I expected, a soft chirp against the concrete, and the parachute deployed behind us, billowing out and slowing us down in a single, confident motion. When we rolled to a stop, the crew was already running toward us, ground carts and checklists in hand. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard inside the helmet, the sweat cooling on my neck, and let it sink in. We had done it. The Blackbird had let me take her into the sky and bring her back in one piece. As the ground crew unstrapped me and helped me down the ladder, the engines ticking as they cooled, I glanced back over my shoulder. The State Route 71 sat there in the desert sun, black and sharp and impossibly still, like she hadn't just rewritten the rules of the world. And I knew then that nothing else I'd ever fly would come close. The first time we broke past 80,000 feet, I finally understood why so many pilots called the Blackbird a time machine. The climb started the same as always: steady throttle, smooth control inputs, the J-58S singing in that raw, metallic scream that never got old. But as the air thinned and the cockpit temperature spiked, there was a moment when the entire world below simply fell away. At 60,000 feet, the sky shifts to a darker shade of blue, something richer than what you see from any commercial jet. At 70, it deepens to indigo. And by the time you're climbing past 80, you're staring at the edge of space itself. Out the windows, the Earth doesn't look like land and sea anymore, it looks like a map, a curved horizon stretching endlessly, with a thin line of atmosphere glowing faintly against the black void above. Inside the cockpit, every sound feels sharper. The hiss of the oxygen flow, the constant buzz of the environmental systems, the quiet hum of the electronics, it all blends into a white noise that somehow makes the silence feel even bigger. The pressure suit is tight, almost suffocating, but you don't notice after a while. What you notice is how still everything feels. At that altitude, there's no turbulence, no weather, just the steady, almost surreal smoothness of a ride that feels more like sliding across glass than flying. The RSO's voice broke the trance. Leveling at 8-1. Instruments steady. Copy, I said, my own voice sounding smaller inside the helmet. I checked the gauges out of habit, engine temps nominal, fuel flow balanced, cabin pressure holding. Everything perfect. And yet, the perfection felt fragile, as if the smallest mistake could shatter it all. I glanced down. The entire western United States was beneath us, vast and quiet. The Pacific shimmered on the horizon, sunlight catching the water like broken glass. Somewhere down there, people were driving to work, drinking coffee, living their lives completely unaware that a black dart was carving invisible lines high above their heads. That feeling never left me, the sense of isolation, but also of responsibility. Up here, there's no one to call for help, no alternate runway to divert to if something goes wrong. It's just you, your RSO, and a machine that tolerates no errors. Every input, every calculation matters. At Mach 3.2, there's no time to hesitate. Navigation locked, the RSO said, tapping his panel. Course is green. Next waypoint in 4 minutes. I eased the yoke slightly, tiny corrections that most people would never notice but that kept us exactly where we needed to be. The Blackbird didn't forgive laziness. If you let her drift even a little, you'd spend the next 10 minutes wrestling to get her back on track. Time worked differently up here. Ground speed was over 2,000 miles per hour, but inside the cockpit, everything slowed down. You learned to read the instruments in micro-glances, to listen to the subtle changes in the engine tone, to anticipate shifts before they happened. It wasn't adrenaline that kept you sharp, it was focus, a razor-edged calm that left no room for fear or doubt. I remember looking out toward the horizon during that first high-altitude run, my hand resting on the throttles, and realizing how thin the line between control and chaos really was. One flameout, one hydraulic failure, and we'd be gliding a black brick through the upper stratosphere, hoping the ejection systems did what they were supposed to. The thought wasn't frightening, it was grounding. It reminded you that the Blackbird wasn't your aircraft. You were her guest. We crossed state lines in seconds, streaking over entire cities that looked like pinpricks of light on the ground. Radio chatter from the ground control stations was calm, professional, but there was always a slight reverence in their voices when they spoke to us. They knew what we were riding. They knew the stakes. At cruise speed, the skin of the jet was hotter than boiling water. You couldn't see it from inside, but you knew the panels were expanding, shifting slightly as the airframe heated. The smell of hot titanium seeped into the cockpit, mixing with the constant metallic tang of the oxygen system. It wasn't unpleasant, it was just the smell of the Blackbird, a reminder of where you were and what you were doing. Target sight in 2 minutes, the RSO said. Roger, I replied, my eyes scanning the horizon. From this altitude, there were no landmarks, just endless layers of earth tones broken by the occasional glint of water or mountain shadow. But the sensors knew where we were, even if my eyes didn't. We stayed in that rhythm for what felt like hours but was barely an hour and a half. High-altitude flight in the Blackbird was strange like that, time bent around you, stretched thin. The mission clock said we were right on schedule, but it felt like we were frozen above the world, suspended in a place where speed didn't matter and distance didn't exist. Then came the call, all data collected. Ready to turn. I brought the yoke around gently, no sudden movements, feeling the subtle resistance of the control surfaces biting into the thin air. The Blackbird responded like she always did, smooth, precise, alive. Heading home was quieter. The RSO worked through his checklists while I stayed locked in, eyes on the instruments, listening for anything out of place. Up here, a minor anomaly could snowball into a catastrophe faster than you could react. But the gauges stayed steady, the engines roared in perfect sync, and the horizon line slowly shifted as we made our way back. Breaking the descent was almost disappointing. The dark sky lightened gradually, the deep indigo fading to pale blue as we dropped below 60,000 feet. The world below came into sharper focus, details emerging where there had only been colors and shadows before. By the time we dropped through 30,000, the ride got rougher, the air denser. The Blackbird shuddered slightly, like she resented coming down from her perch above it all. Touching down on the runway, the world felt smaller, noisier. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft as we rolled to a stop, but for a few seconds, I just sat there in the cockpit, staring straight ahead, letting the silence settle. We had been to the edge of space and back. Above it all, where the world curved away beneath us and the sky turned black, where speed and distance lost their meaning, the Blackbird had shown me her world, and let me come home. We were somewhere over the Baltic when the first warning came through. It started as a faint tone in my headset, a sharp, almost metallic ping that you never wanted to hear. The RSO didn't need to say a word, I could see it on his display. A radar lock. Someone on the ground had just found us. At that altitude, above 80,000 feet, you felt untouchable. The Blackbird wasn't just fast, it was faster than anything anyone had ever built to catch it. But that didn't mean we were invisible. The enemy could see us. They just couldn't reach us. Usually. Lock confirmed, the RSO said, his voice flat but tight. Copy, I replied, my eyes darting to the gauges. Airspeed steady. Temps holding. Everything normal. The irony of it never left me, our lives could depend on whether a titanium panel stayed within a few degrees of tolerance, and yet, in that moment, the cockpit felt calm. The second tone came seconds later, louder, more insistent. Missile launch, the RSO said. Those words hit differently. You train for it, you drill for it, but when you hear it for real, your stomach drops. Someone out there had just fired a surface-to-air missile, and now it was climbing, hunting for us. Turning 20 degrees, I said, hands steady on the yoke. The Blackbird didn't like abrupt moves at Mach 3.2, but you didn't have the luxury of staying still. The smallest course change could throw off a missile's trajectory, and every second mattered. The RSO's voice was calm but clipped. Tracking, missile closing. Outside, the horizon looked the same, curved earth below, black sky above, the thin blue line of atmosphere glowing faintly. But inside, the cockpit felt tighter, smaller. The steady roar of the engines sounded louder, more urgent. Throttle up, I said. It wasn't really necessary, the J-58s were already howling, but pushing them harder gave us a psychological edge. The Blackbird surged, the acceleration pressing me back in the seat, Mach creeping higher. The RSO was reading the data in real time. Missile losing energy, adjusting, still closing. You couldn't see them. That was the worst part. No contrails, no flashes of light. Just the invisible certainty that somewhere behind you, a piece of metal packed with explosives was clawing its way through the sky. I nudged the yoke again, a shallow bank, another course correction. The airframe groaned softly under the stress, but she held steady. She always did. Missile falling behind, the RSO said, his tone finally easing. We're clear. For a second, neither of us spoke. The tension sat heavy in the cockpit, mixing with the smell of hot metal and that faint, acrid tang of fuel. Then the RSO exhaled, a sharp sound in my headset. That was close. I didn't answer right away. My eyes were still on the gauges, hands still tight on the controls, waiting for the next alert, the next tone. But the displays stayed quiet. Just the steady hum of systems and the deep, constant roar of those engines carrying us farther and farther from the danger below. Moments like that reminded you of what the Blackbird really was, a machine built to dance on the edge of the impossible. Every mission, every flight, you trusted her to keep you alive in skies where no one else could fly. And every time, she did. But you also learned not to take it for granted. Because the truth was simple, up there, at Mach 3, one small mistake was all it took. We stayed quiet for most of the run after that. The RSO focused on his instruments, collecting the data we'd come for. I stayed on the controls, feeling every vibration, every subtle shift in the airframe. It was like holding your breath for an hour straight, never fully relaxing, never letting go. As we turned south, leaving the hostile airspace behind, the tension began to ease. The tones were gone, the radar screen clear. The only sound was the steady rush of speed, that constant reminder of just how fast and far we could go. Data packets complete, the RSO said finally. Mission accomplished. Those words always hit me the same way. Relief, pride, and that quiet understanding that we'd just done something very few people on the planet would ever experience. On the way back, we didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. We'd been hunted, and we'd outrun the hunt. The Blackbird had done what she was built to do, stay ahead of everything. Crossing back into friendly airspace, the ground stations came alive, their voices calm but laced with something unspoken, respect, maybe. They knew what we'd just been through, even if they'd never been in that cockpit. The descent felt longer that day. Maybe it was the adrenaline wearing off, or maybe it was just that after living on the edge for hours, coming back down to earth felt ordinary. The sky went from black to indigo to pale blue, the horizon flattening, the ground slowly rising to meet us. Touching down, the runway rushed up to greet us, and the Blackbird settled with her usual grace, even after everything she'd just endured. The ground crew moved quickly, as always, but I stayed in the cockpit for a moment, hands resting on the throttles, eyes fixed on the horizon. We'd been chased by missiles moving at thousands of miles an hour, and we'd walked away without a scratch. That wasn't luck. That was the Blackbird. She was faster, stronger, smarter than anything the world had ever thrown at her. But as I climbed down from the cockpit, helmet tucked under my arm, I felt that quiet reminder settle in again. She didn't belong to us. Every flight was alone, every mission a borrowed moment in a machine that demanded your absolute best. And that day, high over hostile skies, when the alarms blared and the world tried to catch us, she reminded me why no other aircraft would ever feel the same. There's a kind of silence you can only find above 80,000 feet. It's not the absence of sound. Inside the cockpit, the J-58 engines still roar, the avionics hum, and the airflow hisses across the titanium skin, but somehow, all of it fades into the background. What's left is something deeper, something that makes you feel like you're the only person alive on Earth. I first noticed it on a solo ferry flight to Beale. No reconnaissance run, no complicated data to collect, just me, my RSO, and a flight plan that cut across most of the continental United States. The mission profile was simple: get her home fast and safe. We leveled out at Mach 3.2, climbing through 70,000 feet, and then the world just fell away. From up there, the planet doesn't look hostile. There are no borders, no cities, no flashing warnings on the radar. It's just the curve of the Earth, the soft gradient of atmosphere, and the endless black above, scattered with stars you could never see from the ground in daylight. "Smooth ride today," my RSO said over the intercom, his voice relaxed. "Yeah," I replied, my hands light on the yoke. "Feels like she's on rails." For a long stretch, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward, it was the opposite. The Blackbird had a way of quieting everything, your thoughts, your fears, even the noise of the job. Up there, cruising faster than a rifle bullet, you could almost forget the world below. I remember looking down at the Rockies, the peaks breaking through a thin veil of clouds, the shadows stretching for miles. It looked peaceful, untouched. And for a few minutes, I let myself just watch. People always asked what it felt like to fly her, expecting some technical answer, numbers, procedures, checklists. But those moments of silence, those rare stretches when nothing needed to be said or done, that's what it really felt like. Like being somewhere no one else could be. On another mission, somewhere over the Atlantic, the silence felt heavier. We'd just completed a high-risk run along hostile airspace, gathering intel no satellite could have gotten at the time. There'd been tension, radar locks, chatter on the encrypted line, ground crews warning us of possible intercepts. But by the time we turned for home, the sky had cleared, and so had the comms. "Data looks clean," the RSO said quietly, almost to himself. I didn't respond. My focus was forward, on the instruments, but my mind was somewhere else. I could feel the adrenaline fading, that familiar crash after the rush, leaving behind only the hum of the engines and the dark, endless sky. There's something about that silence that makes you think. About the machine you're strapped into, the ground crews who make sure she's perfect, the risks you take every time you light those engines. About the fact that, up there, 1,000 things could go wrong and no one would ever find you. But mostly, you think about the Blackbird herself. She was more than a plane, she was alive in her own way. Every sound, every vibration told you something. In the silence, you could hear her talking, whispering, almost, reminding you that she was with you, that she'd get you home if you treated her right. Sometimes, in those quiet stretches, my RSO and I would talk, not about the mission but about life on the ground, kids, baseball, the restaurants we'd hit when we finally got a weekend off. It felt strange, talking about ordinary things while traveling faster than anyone else in human history, but it grounded us. Reminded us that we were still just two people doing a job, not superheroes riding a titanium arrow. The longest silence I ever felt came on a night flight over the Pacific. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen, and the moonlight painted the skin of the Blackbird in silver and shadow. For hundreds of miles, there was nothing but open water below and the infinite black above. No radio calls. No chatter. Not even the occasional static burst you get from the ground. I remember my RSO saying, almost in a whisper, "It's like we're not even here." And that's exactly how it felt. Like we'd slipped between the cracks of the world, existing in a place no one else could touch. By the time we began our descent, the silence had become something I didn't want to leave. The lower we dropped, the more the world came back: radio calls, turbulence, the hum of nearby air traffic. The spell broke, and suddenly we were just pilots again, lining up for another landing. People talk about the speed, the danger, the missions that push the limits of human engineering, but they don't talk much about the quiet. About those moments when the Blackbird carried you so far above everything that the rest of the world simply disappeared. Looking back, those were the times that stayed with me the most. Not the briefings, not the headlines, not even the close calls. It was the silence, those rare, perfect minutes when the earth curved away beneath us and the sky stretched into forever. Flying the State Route 71 taught me a lot about risk, precision, and trust. But what it taught me most was how small and fragile we are compared to the vastness around us. And how, in that fragile space, we found a kind of peace that only a handful of people will ever understand. I used to think about that every time I touched the Blackbird's skin during pre-flight, the titanium still cool in the early morning. I'd wonder if, up there, she felt the same, gliding through that silence, untouchable and alone, carrying us to places no one else could go. Even now, years later, when I hear recordings of her engines or see old photos, that silence comes rushing back. The world falls away, the stars sharpen, and I'm back in that cockpit, weightless and steady, above it all. Those were the moments that reminded me why we flew her. Not just for the mission, or the data, or the advantage she gave us, but for those rare, fleeting stretches of pure, unbroken silence where we could feel, for just a little while, like we were part of something far greater than ourselves. There's a point, somewhere beyond Mach 3, where you stop thinking about speed the way most people understand it. At that point, numbers lose their meaning. You're no longer flying through the air, you're skimming the edge of it, slicing the sky with a machine that feels more alive than anything you've ever touched. That's where the Blackbird lived. And that's where she tested every ounce of who you were. The first time I felt her strain at the edge of her envelope was during a test profile out of Beale. The mission was straightforward on paper: high altitude, high-speed data collection, validating some new modifications on the inlet controls. The engineers wanted to see how stable the air spikes were under extreme conditions. My RSO and I knew what that meant. We were about to take her as far as she would let us go. We launched early, climbing hard and clean. By the time we leveled at 70,000 feet, I could already feel her pulling, as if she was eager to climb higher, faster. "Stable so far," my RSO reported. "Copy that," I said, nudging the throttles forward. "Let's see what she's got." The J-58S answered with that familiar surge, a deep, guttural roar that felt more like a living thing than a machine. The airspeed indicator spun upward, Mach 2.8, then Mach 3.0, then beyond. The skin temperature gauges climbed fast. I could feel the cockpit heating, even through the pressure suit. It wasn't dangerous, yet, but it was a reminder that we were dancing on the edge of physics. At Mach 3.2, the first vibration started. Subtle at first, just a tremor you could almost dismiss. Then it grew sharper, running through the stick, through the seat, through every nerve in my body. "Inlet unstarts," my RSO warned, his voice tight. "Copy," I replied, hands steady. I eased the throttles, recalibrated the spikes, and just like that, she smoothed out again. But my pulse didn't. That was the thing about the Blackbird, she demanded respect. Push too hard, and she'd remind you who was in charge. But if you listened, if you treated her like the temperamental masterpiece she was, she'd take you places no other plane could. We stayed at those limits longer than we should have that day. The data guys wanted every second they could get, and honestly, so did I. There was something addictive about it, knowing you were sitting in the fastest manned aircraft ever built, wringing every ounce of performance from her frame, trusting her to hold together when every calculation said she should. Later missions would push us even harder. There were times, deep over hostile airspace, when threats forced us to do things the books didn't cover. I remember one run over Eastern Europe where ground radar lit us up early, their signals bouncing off our fuselage like angry hornets. "Spike, bearing 210, my RSO called out. "Copy." "Lighting it up," I said, and pushed the throttles forward. The Blackbird leapt. Mach 3.2, Mach 3.3, the gauges dancing dangerously close to red lines. The skin temperature warnings chimed. At those speeds, the titanium was expanding so much that panels you could slip a finger into on the ground were sealed tight, the airframe literally reshaping itself around us. Every second stretched into forever. You don't think about fear in those moments, you think about precision. About holding her steady, about listening to every sound, every vibration, waiting for the tiniest sign that something might be about to fail. And then, just like that, the radar threats faded. We were gone, untouchable. The debrief later would talk about mission success, about the clean intel package we brought home. But what I remember most is the feeling of those minutes, the sheer force of the Blackbird under my hands, the sensation that we were flying faster than the Earth itself could keep up with. Not every push ended cleanly. There were moments when we crossed a line we shouldn't have, even if we didn't realize it until afterward. One high-speed descent sticks in my memory. We'd been ordered to drop altitude fast, trying to get below a weather front that was causing turbulence even at 70,000 feet. The air got thick quick, the friction building heat we hadn't planned for. Alarms started flashing. The cockpit felt like an oven. For a moment, I thought we'd cook something vital. But the Blackbird held. She always held. When we finally landed, the ground crew found streaks of burned paint along the leading edges of the wings. One mechanic looked up at me, shook his head, and said, "Sir, she was mad at you today." He wasn't wrong. What you learned, flying her at those limits, was that the Blackbird wasn't just a machine. She was a partner. Push her recklessly, and she'd fight you every step of the way. But if you learned her rhythms, trusted her instincts as much as your own, she'd carry you through anything. It's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't been there. The engineers, the planners, even the brass, they saw data, charts, performance envelopes. We saw something different. We felt her. And in those moments, when the line between control and chaos blurred, we knew she felt us, too. Years later, pilots would joke that every Blackbird had her own personality. Some were smooth, some were twitchy, some had quirks you only discovered at Mach 3. I don't know if it was true, but I know this, every time I pushed her to her edge, I felt like we were having a conversation. Me asking for just a little more. Her deciding whether to give it. And every time she did, every time she let us dance on that razor's edge and lived to tell about it, I walked away humbled. People called us fearless, but that's not true. You can't be fearless in a machine like that. What you can be is focused, disciplined, and aware that you are writing a masterpiece that answers only to itself. Looking back, those moments when we pushed her hardest were the ones that defined the Blackbird for me. Not the headlines, not the statistics, but the quiet understanding that, together, we'd gone farther, faster, and higher than anyone thought possible, and somehow, we'd made it back. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel it, the rumble through the stick, the roar of the engines, the shimmer of heat in the cockpit as the world blurred below us. That was the edge. That was the Blackbird. And that was where I felt most alive. The morning of my last flight in the Blackbird didn't feel like history. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just the quiet hum of the hangar and the smell of jet fuel that had become so familiar over the years. Still, I knew. From the moment I woke up, there was a weight to every movement, a sharpness to every sound, like the airplane itself knew this was goodbye. The pre-flight briefing was routine, almost painfully so. The mission profile was simple, a high-altitude run over the Pacific to collect atmospheric data for NASA, then a descent and final landing at Edwards. Nothing dangerous, nothing extraordinary. And yet, as I signed my name on that stack of flight papers, my hands lingered on the pen a second longer than usual. Out on the ramp, the Blackbird waited, black as midnight, her skin glinting in the early California sun. I'd seen her like that 100 times, maybe more, but that morning she looked different. She always had a presence, an authority that filled the space around her. But now, standing there in my pressure suit, helmet under my arm, she seemed to be watching me too. The crew moved around her in silence, more subdued than usual. No one said it out loud, but we all understood this was the last time this bird, my bird, would taste the sky. Climbing the ladder into the cockpit felt heavier than usual. My RSO strapped in behind me, and when the canopy closed with that sharp metallic thunk, it hit me. This was it. One last flight. Engine start was as flawless as ever. The J-58S roared to life, shaking the ground beneath us, their familiar deep growl vibrating through the airframe. Taxiing out, I caught glimpses of the ground crew watching from the sidelines, some with cameras, some just standing still, hands in pockets. I tried not to think about it. tower cleared us for takeoff, and as the throttles went forward, the Blackbird responded like she always did, with raw, unrelenting power. The acceleration pressed me into the seat, the desert runway blurring beneath us until, with a lightness that never got old, we were airborne. The climb was perfect. Smooth. Effortless. She'd always been fast, but that morning, it felt like she was giving me something extra, a quiet acknowledgement that she knew this was the last dance. At 70,000 feet, the world curved gently along the horizon, the sky above fading to the kind of deep, endless blue that few people will ever see. We hit cruise, and the cockpit settled into that strange calm that only the Blackbird could create, a mix of vibration, heat, and silence that made time feel slower. Below us, the Pacific stretched out forever, dotted with whitecaps that looked like scattered dust from that height. I thought I'd be too focused to feel anything, but as the minutes ticked by, memories flooded in. First flights. Near misses. The sound of my RSO's voice during those tense moments when the aircraft felt like it was about to come apart. The way the ground crew would look up with quiet pride every time we brought her home. The missions that never made it into the reports. The ones that did. Somewhere near the edge of our flight plan, my RSO came on the intercom. "You good back there?" "Yeah," I said, though my throat was tight. Just taking it all in. He didn't answer, and he didn't need to. On the way back, we pushed her a little, not recklessly, but enough to feel her strength one last time. Mach 3.1. The gauge is steady. The hum through the controls as perfect as it had ever been. She never let us down. Not once. The descent toward Edwards was quiet. We both knew what came next, but neither of us said a word. The base came into view, that familiar stretch of dry lakebed shimmering in the distance. My hands were steady on the stick, but my chest was tight. Touchdown was smooth, almost gentle, like she was doing her best to make the ending easier on me. As we rolled to a stop, the ground crew moved in, guiding us into position for shutdown. The engine spooled down with that deep, fading rumble, and the silence that followed felt like a punch to the gut. When the canopy opened, the desert air rushed in, warm and dry. I sat there for a moment longer than I should have, helmet in my lap, hands resting on the controls. I wanted to memorize the feel of it, the way the cockpit smelled, the hum of the electronics cooling, the faint ticking of hot metal settling. Climbing down the ladder, I didn't look back right away. The crew clapped me on the shoulder, offering quiet congratulations. Someone handed me a bottle of water. But when I finally turned, when I finally looked at her, it hit me all at once. She'd flown her last mission. Over the years, I'd heard people try to explain what the Blackbird was. A marvel of engineering. A Cold War legend. A piece of history. All of that was true. But to those of us who flew her, she was more than that. She was a partner. A teacher. Sometimes a challenge, sometimes a comfort, always a presence that demanded your best and gave hers in return. As the sun dipped lower over the desert, casting her in that same golden light she'd worn so many mornings, I realized something. For all the records and all the stories, what I would remember most wasn't the speed or the altitude. It was the quiet moments, the hum in the cockpit, the way she felt steady under my hands when everything else was chaos, the absolute trust we'd built together. Walking away that evening, I didn't say goodbye. I couldn't. Some things don't end, not really. They stay with you, in the back of your mind, in the rhythm of your heartbeat, in the way the world feels slower when you know what it's like to fly faster than anyone else ever has. The Blackbird may have flown her final flight that day, but for me, and for every pilot who ever touched her controls, she never really landed. People always ask the same question: what was it like? They want to hear about the numbers, the records, the science. They want to know how it feels to push a machine past Mach 3, to climb so high you can see the curve of the Earth. And sure, I can give them those details. But the truth is, none of that really explains it. Flying the Blackbird wasn't just about speed or altitude, it was about existing in a world that few people will ever understand. The first thing that struck you every single time was the power. On the runway, strapped into that pressure suit, visor down, you could feel the airplane pulsing beneath you, like a living thing waiting to be set loose. The J-58S started as a deep growl, low and steady, but when the throttles went forward, the world changed. The airframe trembled, the sound became a roar that you felt in your bones. And then, suddenly, the runway was gone. Takeoff was just the beginning. As we climbed, there was this moment where the Blackbird stopped feeling like an airplane and started feeling like something else entirely. She didn't just fly, she escaped. The desert dropped away, the horizon widened, and the sky above darkened into that deep, impossible shade of blue that only astronauts and a handful of us have ever seen. That color stays with you. Even now, I can close my eyes and see it, like standing at the edge of infinity. At cruise, up around 80,000 feet, the world below didn't look real anymore. Cities were just patterns of light, coastlines were sharp lines drawn on a map, and weather systems looked like slow-moving giants. Down there, people were living their lives, going to work, having coffee, never knowing there was a black arrow slicing across the edge of space above them. That disconnect never stopped feeling strange. And then there was the silence. People don't expect that part. They think it's all noise and chaos, but at Mach 3, the cockpit settled into this eerie calm. There was the hum of the systems, the quiet chatter with the RSO, but mostly it was just stillness. Outside, the air was too thin to carry sound. It felt like the rest of the world had been turned off, like you'd stepped outside time itself. But the Blackbird demanded everything from you. She didn't forgive mistakes. The heat on the skin climbed past 500 degrees, the fuel tanks shifted as the JP-7 sloshed in their compartments, and every gauge mattered. You had to listen to her, every vibration, every whisper of turbulence, because she would always tell you if something was wrong. And if you didn't hear it, if you missed it even for a second, she'd remind you who was in charge. I remember one flight, somewhere over the Atlantic, when we hit a patch of unexpected turbulence. At those speeds, turbulence isn't a bump, it's a punch. The airframe shuddered hard enough to make my teeth click. For a second, just a second, it felt like she was going to come apart. But then she steadied, like she always did. That's the thing about the Blackbird, she'd scare you, humble you, and then carry you home. What people never understand is how physical it was. The pressure suit was heavy and stiff. The cockpit was cramped, hot, and smelled faintly of fuel and metal. The helmet pressed into your head, the gloves made even simple movements clumsy, and sweat would bead on your face only to vanish in the dry air. But none of that mattered when you looked out the canopy and saw the world the way only a handful of humans ever have. The missions were long, sometimes over 10 hours, but they blurred together in memory. What sticks are the moments. The quiet before takeoff, when the crew gave you that last nod. The tension of a high-speed pass over hostile territory, every system on edge, knowing you were untouchable but still feeling exposed. The subtle shift in your chest when you crossed Mach 3, the cockpit vibrating with controlled violence, and you realized you were traveling faster than a rifle bullet. And then, always, the return. Dropping down through the layers of air, feeling the world rush back in. The pressure suit loosening as you descended. The familiar sight of the runway coming into focus. The screech of the tires as you touched down and the roar of the J-58S spooling down to silence. That moment, helmet off, canopy open, the cool air rushing in, was always a mix of relief and awe. You'd climbed into the Blackbird again, and once again, she'd brought you home. People think the records were the point. The fastest, the highest, the farthest. But the truth is, the numbers were just a byproduct. What mattered was the feeling. The way the airplane demanded respect and rewarded precision. The way she made you part of something bigger, part of a story that started in secret hangars and deserts and ended in history books. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain it. The Blackbird wasn't just an aircraft. She was a presence. You didn't just fly her, you earned her trust. And once you had it, once you understood her, she gave you something that no other machine ever could, a glimpse of what it meant to be truly untethered, to move through the world faster and higher than anyone else. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I catch myself looking up at the sky, wondering if anyone down here ever really notices what's moving above them. They don't, of course. They never did. But I smile anyway, because I remember. I remember the way the horizon curved, the way the stars were visible even in daylight, the way the earth itself seemed to hold its breath as we passed overhead. What was it like? It was humbling. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. It was knowing that for a few short hours, you were part of something no one else could touch. And when you stepped out of that cockpit, when your boots hit the tarmac and you peeled off the helmet, you knew you'd been somewhere most people couldn't even imagine. The State Route 71 never stopped feeling like a dream. Even now, it doesn't feel real. But when I close my eyes, I can still feel the weight of the stick in my hand, the steady hum of the engines, and the impossible quiet at the edge of the sky. That's what it was like. And for the rest of my life, no matter where I am, a part of me will always be there, alone, steady, and free, flying faster than the world could ever catch.